Imagine a night, not a night of our time, flooded with soulless electric light, but a deep, velvet, primordial night of the 14th century. We are in the heart of Europe, within the walls of a stern, stone monastery that seems less a creation of human hands and more a part of the very rock it is rooted in. The air is still and cold. It smells of incense, melting wax, and ancient, sacred dust. Somewhere far away, beyond the thick walls, in the impenetrable forest, a wolf might be howling, mourning the world's loneliness. Inside, an almost absolute reverent silence reigns, broken only by the rare crackle of logs burning down in the hearth and another barely perceptible sound, a scratch. Quiet, monotonous, persistent, as if time itself were marking its own passage. Let us peer into a tiny cell carved from stone, illuminated only by the flickering, weak flame of a single tallow candle. At a rough table hewn from oak, a man sits hunched over. He is a monk, but right now, he is not praying in the conventional sense. He is creating a prayer. His coarse wool robe is worn at the elbows, and his calloused fingers are permanently stained with ink that has seeped into his skin, becoming a part of him. His name might be Brother Anselm, or Brother Columba, or Brother Bede. His name is of no importance, for he is one of thousands like him, a nameless soldier in the army fighting against oblivion. Before him lies a sheet of parchment, smooth and pale in the deceptive firelight. This is not paper. This is the skin of a newborn lamb, soaked for weeks in a caustic lime solution to remove the wool, then stretched taut on a wooden frame and scraped for hours with a curved knife until it became thin, strong, and receptive to ink. An entire flock was needed for the single book he is now creating. His tool is a goose quill, cut and sharpened in a specific way, which must be constantly repointed. His fingers, cramped with tension, slowly, with inhuman, supernatural patience, draw letter after letter. Each Gothic minuscule, each ornate curve, is not just a symbol, but a work of art, demanding dozens of tiny, measured movements. He silently moves his lips, whispering the words as he writes them, breathing life into them, consecrating them with his breath. This is a sacred labor, a meditation, a prayer embodied in ink. He fights against the gnawing pain in his back that has become his eternal companion, against the bone-chilling cold, against the fatigue in his eyes, which are no longer as sharp as they were a decade ago. One mistake, one drop of sweat or wax falling upon the precious page, and hours of work would be ruined. He would have to carefully scrape the error away with a knife, risking tearing a hole in the parchment, which is worth a fortune. He is a scribe, a keeper of knowledge. In his hands rests the future of a single copy of the Gospel of John. The creation of this book will take more than a year of his life, a year of pain, prayer, and self-denial. His work is an act of faith that knowledge must live on. And now, a sudden glitch, a tear in the fabric of time. Imagine a deafening roar, the methodical clang of metal, the smell of hot lead, machine oil, and printing ink. We leap forward just over 100 years, to a workshop in the German city of Mainz. There is no silence or reverence here. Here, an organized business-like chaos reigns. A massive wooden press, similar to those used for pressing grapes, descends with a dull, powerful thud onto a sheet of paper. Workers, their hands and faces smudged with soot, scurry back and forth, their movements quick and precise. One, a compositor, swiftly and without looking, plucks tiny metal letters from the compartments of a type case and places them in a wooden composing stick, assembling line after line. Another, a pressman, applies a viscous, oily ink to the assembled metal page using leather pads called ink balls. A third powerfully turns the heavy lever of the press. Once, and a perfectly straight, clear impression is made. Twice, and another. In a single hour, this machine can produce 250 pages, more than Brother Anselm, for all his diligence, could transcribe in a month of torturous labor? What if every book in the world, up to a certain point, was the fruit of months or even years of pain, devotion, and faith? How could one man, not a saint or a prophet, but an enterprising businessman mired in debt and lawsuits, destroy this 1,000-year-old heritage, this sacred profession, in just a few short years? And most importantly, why did this invention, born of chaos and financial disputes, change your life today more than any coronation, any battle, any empire? This is not just a story about a machine. It is a saga of the collision of two worlds. The world of slow, handmade, sacred knowledge, guarded for centuries by nameless scribe heroes, and the world of fast, mass-produced democratic knowledge unleashed by a revolutionary genius. It is the story of how knowledge ceased to be a treasure for the chosen few and became a weapon available to the masses. We will follow the entire path, from ancient inks made of soot and oak galls to a clever alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. From the quiet, hushed monastic scriptoriums to noisy, ink-stained printing shops. From the legal drama that ruined the inventor to the religious revolutions that engulfed a continent. And we will see how this story, which unfolded more than 500 years ago, still echoes in our digital age, in the world of the internet and artificial intelligence, where some professions disappear while others are born with kaleidoscopic speed. But to fully grasp the scale of this earthquake, this revolution, we must travel even further back in time, long before Brother Anselm and his lonely candle, to a world where knowledge was as fragile as a breath and as fleeting as a spoken word. Before the advent of writing, all of human history, all its laws, myths, scientific discoveries, and genealogies hung by the thinnest, most unreliable of threads: human memory. Imagine an ancient storyteller, an Aoid, standing before a hushed crowd and reciting, from memory, without a single error, the thousands of lines of the Iliad or the Odyssey. He was a living book, a walking library, but his knowledge was fatally vulnerable. It could be distorted in its transmission from teacher to student, or it could die with him from illness or on the battlefield. There was no backup, no reserve copy. Knowledge was bound to the fragile human body. The emergence of the first written media, damp clay tablets in Mesopotamia, onto which cuneiform signs were pressed with a sharp stylus, and long papyrus scrolls in Egypt, was a giant leap. Now, a thought could be fixed, preserved, passed down through generations. But even these media were tragically flawed. Clay was heavy and brittle. Dropping a tablet could mean losing a part of the royal archive forever. Papyrus, made from glued-together strips of river reed, was susceptible to moisture, mold, and insects. And over time, it simply crumbled to dust. Its lifespan rarely exceeded a few hundred years. And yet, it was a miracle. The great libraries of antiquity, like the legendary Library of Alexandria, housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the entire wisdom of the ancient world. But then came fire. The fire that destroyed the Library of Alexandria became an eternal, unhealing scar on the body of civilization, a symbol of the fragility of the preprint era. Millions of ideas, discoveries, poems, and philosophical treatises were lost forever, turned to ash. It was a world where entire strata of knowledge could vanish in an instant. And here, a striking paradox arises. The idea of printing, that is, creating multiple identical impressions from a single form, is actually much, much older than we are accustomed to think. Did you know that printing existed for 700 years before Gutenberg? Why, then, did it not change the world sooner? To answer this question, we must mentally travel from Europe to the Far East, to 7th century China during the Tang Dynasty. It was there that the technology known as xylography, or woodblock printing, was born. The process was brilliant in its simplicity and laboriousness. On a smooth, polished block of pear or date wood, a calligrapher would write the text. A carver would then carefully cut away the wood around each character, leaving the symbols raised in relief. This printing form was coated with ink and pressed onto a sheet of paper. Thus, in the year 868, the Diamond Sutra was created, a scroll nearly 5 meters long, which is considered the world's oldest, precisely dated printed book. It was, in essence, a mass-produced product, created, as the inscription on it states, for universal free distribution in honor of the patron's parents. The technology evolved. Around the year 1040, a Chinese commoner named Bi Sheng took the next revolutionary step. He invented movable type. His characters were made of baked clay and could be combined to create any text. But the real breakthrough happened not in China, but in neighboring Korea. In the 13th century, Korean artisans, drawing on their experience in casting bronze coins, became the first in the world to create movable metal type. Unlike a solid woodblock where the text was fixed, or fragile clay characters, they learned to cast individual, incredibly durable characters from bronze. From these metal cubes, any page could be composed, the desired number of copies printed, and then the form could be broken down and the type reused for a new book. The oldest surviving book printed in this way is called the Jikji. It is a collection of Buddhist texts created at the Hyungdeok Temple in Korea in 1377, a full 78 years before Gutenberg's famous Bible. So why did neither Chinese xylography nor Korean metal type spark a revolution in the world on the same scale as Gutenberg's press? There are several reasons. First, cultural barriers and geographical isolation. But the main fundamental reason lay in the very nature of the Eastern languages. Chinese and Korean writing is based on tens of thousands of unique characters. Creating a complete set of type for such a language was an incredibly complex and laborious task. This made the process expensive and not much more efficient than hand-carving woodblocks for xylography, especially for small print runs. Europeans, in this sense, were fantastically lucky. Their Latin alphabet consisted of only a few dozen letters. This colossal difference became the key to the future success of the European printing revolution. Meanwhile, in Europe, primitive forms of printing also existed. From the 14th century, the xylographic method was used to print playing cards, cheap religious icons for illiterate pilgrims, and so-called Biblia Pauperum, Bibles of the poor, which were books consisting mainly of pictures with short captions. But these were pictures with text, not the other way around. Carving a full page of straight, dense text on wood was practically impossible, and the block itself wore out quickly. These methods supplemented the work of scribes, serving the low end of the market, but they could in no way replace it. It was into this world, a world of fragile knowledge and imperfect technologies, a world where a book was a treasure, that they came, the keepers of the flame, the builders of bridges across the dark ages. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, Europe plunged into chaos. Great cities were destroyed, trade routes were cut off, and centralized authority vanished. The classical knowledge accumulated over a millennium was almost entirely lost. The only islands of literacy, culture, and order that remained were the monasteries. Behind their thick, impenetrable walls, far from wars, epidemics, and barbarism, monks performed their titanic, thankless labor. They were saving civilization. In monasteries like St. Gall in Switzerland, Monte Cassino in Italy, or on the Irish island of Iona, special workshops called scriptoriums were organized. These were rooms where, under the strictest discipline and in almost complete silence, dozens of monks copied books day after day, year after year. They transcribed the Bible, the works of the Church Fathers, and the lives of saints. But not only that. They also copied the ancient pagan authors, Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, Cicero, and works on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Without their painstaking labor, most of the classical heritage upon which the Renaissance would later be built, as on a solid foundation, would have been lost to us forever. Who were these people? The scribes. Initially, they were exclusively monks, for whom copying books was a form of service to God, akin to prayer or physical labor in the fields. But from the 12th century, with the growth of cities and the emergence of the first universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, a huge demand for books arose that the monasteries could no longer meet. Secular scribes appeared. These were professional artisans who worked in urban workshops, commissioned by professors, students, lawyers, and wealthy citizens. There were even female scribes, mainly in convents. Becoming a scribe required years of grueling training. One had to have a perfect command of Latin and master complex calligraphic scripts such as unsealed Carolingian minuscule, or the later angular and cramped Gothic script. Let's return to our brother Anselm and imagine his typical day. It begins before dawn, with prayer in a cold church. Then, after a meager breakfast of a piece of bread and a mug of ale, he goes to the scriptorium, where he will work until sunset, breaking only for services. He sits in his small niche, called a carrel, hunched for hours over a sloping lectern. In winter, the ink can freeze in the inkwell and must be thawed over a candle. His fingers grow numb from the cold. The light from a narrow, unglazed window or from the candle is dim and constantly flickering, putting a monstrous strain on his eyes. By the age of 40, many scribes suffered from arthritis, curvature of the spine, and had nearly lost their sight. It was a physically torturous job. And what tools and materials did they use? The foundation of everything was parchment, which was valued as much as gold. Its production was a long, dirty process that required great skill. The skin of an animal, usually a sheep, goat, or calf, was first washed and then soaked in a lime solution for up to 10 days to soften the wool and epidermis. It was then stretched on a wooden frame, and a special semicircular knife was used to scrape off the remaining wool and flesh. After that, the skin was polished with pumice stone, and chalk powder was rubbed into it to remove grease and make the surface smooth and ready to absorb ink. The highest quality and most expensive parchment, vellum, was made from the skin of newborn or even unborn calves. It was incredibly thin, white, and smooth, and was used for the most luxurious manuscripts. Next came the ink. The most common ink in the Middle Ages, used for centuries, was iron gall ink. Its recipe was complex. So-called oak galls, spherical growths formed on oak leaves by the larvae of the gall wasp, were collected, dried, crushed, and steeped for weeks in water, wine, or vinegar. To this infusion, rich in tannic acids, iron sulfate was added. A chemical reaction created a water-soluble complex that, when applied to the parchment and exposed to oxygen, oxidized, turning into a durable, insoluble black pigment. To add viscosity, cherry gum or gum arabic, acacia resin, was added to the ink. This ink bit deep into the parchment and was almost impossible to erase. But over time, due to excess acid, it could literally burn through the page. The work was excruciatingly slow and demanded extreme concentration. Mistakes, which scribes jokingly called peccata, from the Latin for sins, were inevitable. Sometimes they could be carefully scraped away with a special small knife, but often the entire page had to be rewritten. It is not surprising that in the margins of many manuscripts, one can find notes left by weary scribes. The end at last, thank God. This page was written in the dim evening light. The wine is good, but the water is bad, or even curses aimed at the pen and ink. These small human touches make their labor all the more poignant and alive. What was the value of these books? It was exorbitant. A single, hand-copied Bible, decorated with miniatures, could cost as much as an entire estate or the annual income of a prosperous merchant. Books were symbols of status, wealth, and power, accessible only to the highest clergy, aristocracy, and monarchs. They were not just carriers of information, but works of art, sacred relics. The scribes were the bridge thrown across the dark ages of oblivion. They carried the entire weight of Western civilization on their stooped shoulders. But their labor, their art, their very profession, was doomed. A man was approaching whose name would become synonymous with revolution. His name was Johannes Gensfleisch, zur Laden zum Gutenberg. We know him simply as Johannes Gutenberg. He was born around the year 1400 in the prosperous German city of Mainz, to a family belonging to the urban aristocracy. His father was a cloth merchant, and his mother's family had connections to the city's mint. Gutenberg himself apparently received training as a jeweler and metallurgist. He knew how to work with metal, was skilled in engraving, minting, and most importantly, casting. These skills would become the cornerstone of his future invention. Gutenberg's life is not the story of a saint or a selfless, lone genius. It is the story of an obsessed, ambitious, and extremely unlucky entrepreneur who spent his entire life balancing on the edge of bankruptcy. In 1428, due to political strife between the guilds and the patricians in Mainz, his family was forced to leave the city, and he moved to Strasbourg. It was there, as court documents attest, that he began his first secret experiments. The records of a 1439 lawsuit have survived, in which Gutenberg's former business partners demand the return of money invested in a mysterious enterprise and art, or Kunst. The documents mention the purchase of lead, the construction of some kind of press, and the making of certain forms. But the nature of the invention is kept a closely guarded secret. It was a commercial secret that Gutenberg desperately protected. Gutenberg was a man of his time. He lived at the dawn of the Renaissance, a time when the thirst for knowledge was growing exponentially. New universities were appearing, trade was developing, literacy among townspeople was increasing, and the demand for books, though slow, was steadily rising. The scribes could no longer keep up. Gutenberg saw this not so much as a cultural mission, but as a massive market opportunity. He didn't just want to create a book. He wanted to create many completely identical books, quickly and most importantly, more cheaply than manuscripts. Returning to his native Mainz around 1448, Gutenberg threw himself into his work. But to realize his grand vision, he needed a huge amount of money. He borrowed from a relative, and then, in 1450, he made a fateful deal that would determine the rest of his life. He found an investor, a wealthy merchant and moneylender named Johann Fust. Fust lent Gutenberg a gigantic sum for the time, 800 guilders, with the future equipment as collateral. With this money, Gutenberg built a workshop and hired assistants, including a talented young calligrapher and engraver named Peter Schoeffer, who had previously worked as a scribe in Paris and, unlike Gutenberg, knew the book market inside out. It was in this workshop, in a partnership that was poisoned by mistrust from the very beginning, that the miracle happened. Gutenberg solved 3 fundamental technical problems that no one in Europe had been able to solve before him, and he combined them into a single, brilliant system. The first and main innovation was movable metal type, cast with unprecedented precision. Let's recall the Koreans. They had already done this with bronze. But Gutenberg, as an experienced metallurgist, approached the problem with German thoroughness. He understood that a special alloy was needed. It had to be fusible enough to be cast quickly, yet hard enough to withstand the immense pressure of the press and not wear out after thousands of impressions. Through long experimentation, he found the ideal recipe, an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. This alloy, known as type metal, had unique properties. It was fluid, solidified quickly, and had low shrinkage, which ensured the perfect precision and uniform height of all the characters. Gutenberg then developed a brilliant and, most importantly, rapid process for mass-producing this type. First, a single letter was carved in reverse on the end of a steel rod, the punch. This hardened punch was then hammered into a softer copper bar, creating a matrix, a perfect, durable mold for casting. This matrix was placed in a special handheld mold device, perhaps Gutenberg's main invention, and the molten type metal was poured into it. A moment later, a finished, perfectly straight character was ejected from the mold. This process allowed a single worker to produce thousands of characters a day. For his famous Bible, Gutenberg needed to create about 290 different symbols, including upper and lowercase letters, punctuation marks, abbreviations, and ligatures, joined letters. The second innovation was the printing press itself. Gutenberg did not invent it from scratch. He adapted the existing screw press, which had been used for centuries in winemaking, cheesemaking, and paper pressing. But he made key improvements. A movable table or carriage on which the composed type form was placed, and a mechanism that allowed a sheet of paper to be pressed against the inked type with enormous, uniform force. His press was a marvel of 15th century engineering. And the third, no less important detail, was the ink. The water-based inks used by scribes were too thin and would have simply run off the smooth metal surface of the type, smearing the paper. Gutenberg needed a thick, viscous, sticky ink that would adhere well to metal and transfer evenly to paper. He developed a recipe based on soot mixed with linseed oil and resin. In essence, he invented the world's first oil-based printing ink, which remained the standard for the next 500 years. By combining these three elements, movable type from a perfect alloy, a powerful press, and oil-based ink, Gutenberg created a system. The revolution was not any single element, but their combination, their synergy. His magnum opus, his greatest creation, is the so-called 42-line Bible. Work on it took place from about 1452 to 1455. Around 180 copies were printed, approximately 145 on paper and 35 on expensive parchment. Gutenberg sought to prove that his printed book was in no way inferior to the best manuscripts, and in some ways even surpassed them, and he succeeded brilliantly. The clarity of the font, the straightness of the lines, the perfect justification of the margins, and the quality of the printing were impeccable. Space for initials and colored illustrations was left blank so that they could be hand-drawn or painted in later by artists' illuminators, just as in the most expensive manuscripts. But it was at the moment of his greatest triumph that Gutenberg suffered a crushing personal and financial defeat. His investor, Johannes Gutenberg, seeing that the project was dragging on and not bringing a quick profit, sued him. He demanded the return not only of the initial 800 guilders, but also a second loan, plus compound interest, which amounted to over 2,000 guilders, an astronomical sum. In November 1455, the court, the record of which has survived to this day, ruled in Fust's favor. The entire printing shop with all its equipment, the finished but unsold copies of the Bible, and even the unique, painstakingly created fonts, became the property of Fust. Gutenberg, the man who gave the world the printing press, was left with nothing, ruined and humiliated. Fust, together with Peter Schoeffer, who not only became his business partner but also his son-in-law, went on to run a very successful printing business, and Gutenberg's name was practically forgotten for many years. He died in 1468 in relative poverty and obscurity, having received only a small pension from the Archbishop of Mainz shortly before his death. But the genie was already out of the bottle. The technology that Gutenberg had so long and zealously guarded began to spread rapidly across Europe. Ironically, a war helped this process. In 1462, an armed conflict broke out in Mainz, and the city was stormed and sacked. Many printers, apprentices of Gutenberg and Schoeffer, fled, taking with them the priceless knowledge of the new black art. They established their own printing shops in other German cities, then in Italy, France, Spain, and England. An information explosion began, the likes of which humanity had not known until the advent of the Internet. By 1500, less than 50 years after the invention, there were more than 1,000 printing presses operating in 270 European cities. During this time, it is estimated that between 10 and 20 million books were printed. This was more than all the manuscript books created in Europe over the preceding millennium. The world had changed forever. What were the consequences of this revolution? They were colossal, all-encompassing, and affected absolutely every sphere of life, redrawing the map of Europe, politically, religiously, intellectually, and economically. The first and most obvious was the democratization of knowledge. The cost of books plummeted. While a manuscript book was a luxury item accessible to a few, a printed book became a commodity that merchants, artisans, less wealthy priests, and students could afford. Literacy, which for centuries had been the preserve of a tiny elite, no more than 10–15% of the population, began to grow rapidly, especially in cities. Knowledge broke free from monastery walls and university libraries and flooded into the streets, into the homes of ordinary people. This became a powerful catalyst for the Renaissance. The works of Plato, Ovid, and Cicero, which had previously existed in dozens of manuscript copies scattered across Europe and full of errors, were now printed in thousands of identical copies and available to scholars everywhere. But the most powerful tectonic shift the printing press caused was in the religious sphere. It became the main weapon of the Reformation. In 1517, an unknown German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses criticizing the practice of selling indulgences to the church door in Wittenberg. In the manuscript era, this document would most likely have remained a subject of debate among a narrow circle of theologians. But the theses were immediately printed, and not only in Latin for scholars, but also in simple, understandable German for the people. Luther's short, sharp, fiery pamphlets became the first media bestseller in history. Over 300,000 copies of his works were printed in a few years. The printing press allowed Luther to appeal directly to millions of people, bypassing and ignoring the church hierarchy. When he translated the Bible into German, every literate German could read the sacred text for himself and decide what it meant, without relying on the interpretation of a priest. This was an act of unprecedented intellectual emancipation. In response, the Catholic Church also began to actively use printing for counter-propaganda and to publish the famous Index of Forbidden Books, which, however, often served as its best advertisement. Next came the scientific revolution. Scientists like Copernicus, Vesalius, Galileo, and Kepler were able to quickly publish their discoveries and distribute them among colleagues throughout Europe. Equally important, printing ensured standardization and accuracy. Now, an astronomer in Krakow and an astronomer in Padua could be sure they were looking at absolutely identical astronomical tables, diagrams, and calculations, without the errors and distortions inevitable in manual copying. This created a pan-European scientific community and accelerated the pace of discovery tenfold. An economic revolution also took place. Printing became a powerful new industry. Printing shops, paper mills, and the professions of compositor, proofreader, and bookseller emerged. Cities that opened printing presses grew significantly faster than their neighbors, attracting capital, skilled workers, and scholars. The development of trade was stimulated by printed maps, calendars, and commercial treatises that spread new knowledge about accounting and business methods. And what happened to our heroes, the scribes? Their story is the quiet but profound tragedy of progress. Their unique art, honed over centuries, became obsolete in literally a single generation. By the beginning of the 16th century, The scriptoriums in the monasteries were empty. The profession of the secular scribe had practically disappeared. Some of them, the luckiest and most flexible, were able to retrain and become compositors in the new printing shops. What an irony of fate, they now assembled from ready-made metal letters what they once had drawn with such labor and love with a quill. But many were simply left without work, without a livelihood. Their sacred labor, their art of calligraphy and illumination, became an anachronism, a craft that no longer fed anyone. They were the first victims of technological unemployment in the new era. Their world, a world of slow, thoughtful, personal creation, where each book was a unique individual, was irrevocably destroyed by a machine that valued speed, quantity, and uniformity over uniqueness. The long-term effects of Gutenberg's invention shaped the world we live in today. Without the printing press, neither the Enlightenment, with its ideas of reason and human rights, nor the American and French revolutions, which were prepared by millions of political pamphlets, would have been conceivable. Without the mass distribution of newspapers and books, the Industrial Revolution would not have happened. The printed word standardized national languages, displacing Latin and creating the basis for the formation of modern nations. And today, in our 21st century, we stand on the threshold of a similar and perhaps even more momentous revolution. The internet, and now artificial intelligence, are changing our world with the same dizzying speed with which the printing press once changed it. Information has become instantaneous, global, and its volume is growing exponentially. New professions are emerging that we couldn't have imagined 10 years ago, and old ones are disappearing just as quickly. Journalists, translators, designers, programmers, lawyers, many today feel the same anxiety, the same existential threat to their craft that the scribes felt at the end of the 15th century, as they watch a machine perform their work faster, cheaper, and at times, no worse. We, like them, live in an era of disruption, at a moment when the familiar ways of creating, distributing, and consuming information are changing radically and irreversibly. The story of Gutenberg and the scribes is not just an entertaining lesson from the past. It is a mirror reflecting our present and perhaps our future. It teaches us that progress is relentless and ambivalent. It always brings with it both great creation and great destruction. It demands sacrifices, but opens up previously unseen horizons. It forces us to adapt, to constantly learn new things, and to find our place in a rapidly changing world. And now, at the end of our long journey, let us return once more to that quiet, cold cell of the 14th century. Brother Anselm is bent over his parchment. The candle flame is dying, casting his giant, hunched shadow on the wall. His hand aches. His eyes are heavy with fatigue. He does not know that in 100 years, the labor to which he has dedicated his entire life will become unnecessary. He does not know that his warm goose quill will be replaced by cold metal, and his quiet prayer by the deafening roar of a machine. He is simply doing his work. He is carefully preserving the small, flickering flame of knowledge in the impenetrable darkness of the ages, passing it on to a future in which he has no place. His quill has been extinguished. His world has vanished. But the light that he and thousands like him carried with such difficulty through the darkness did not go out. Thanks to the machine that made their labor obsolete, this light turned into an all-consuming fire that illuminated and sometimes burned the entire world. And in this lies the greatest paradox and the greatest legacy of this story. The story of how one era ended and our modern world was born.